The ocean was more than a view. It was a pulse I lived by. I could hear it before I opened my eyes each morning, a low, ancient rhythm that wrapped itself around my house like a heartbeat in the wind. The salt air clung to everything. My porch railings, my flannel shirts, even the coffee I brewed at 5:30 a.m. every day without fail. 20 years in this place, and the beach access at the end of my lot had never been more than a short walk from the back gate. Just 30 feet of soft sandy path, shaded by sea grapes and lined with driftwood stakes. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine, or so I thought. I bought the house when my wife was still alive. Back then, we would walk down to the water barefoot, carrying an old woven blanket and a flask of coffee. She'd read and I'd fish, and sometimes we'd just sit in silence, feeling lucky to be exactly where we were. After she passed 7 years ago now, the beach became my anchor. It was where I talked to her, where I remembered how to breathe when the grief crept up like a storm tide. That slice of sand, the curve of the shoreline, the way the sea met the sky, it all felt like a part of my soul. So when the newly formed HOA began to stake their presence in the neighborhood, I didn't think much of it. At first, it was just newsletters and friendly reminders. Then came the inspections and the rules, trash can, placement, grass, height, paint, color, compliance. Still, I played along. I'd served in the Navy for 28 years. I knew what it meant to follow orders, to keep a community tight. But one morning I opened my door and saw orange surveyor flags lining the path from my fence to the dunes. I stood there, coffee in hand, staring at the fluttering flags like they were some kind of code I was supposed to crack. At the very end of the line, 3 men in Navy polos and khakis were studying a clipboard. One of them looked up and gave me a tight-lipped nod. I nodded back and walked over. "You guys surveying storm damage?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "No, sir," the tallest one said. "We're establishing the boundary line for the new HOA-managed coastal easement." I frowned. "That's city land, and the path's been used for decades." He didn't look up from the clipboard. "The HOA's legal team says otherwise." That was the first time I felt a quiet, crawling unease in my gut, like something sacred was being quietly erased. I let it go for the moment, thinking maybe it was a misunderstanding. I sent an email to the HOA president, Evelyn Whitaker, a woman whose smile was as tight as her blazer, and whose tone in meetings had always reminded me of a commanding officer who'd never actually seen combat. Her reply came swift and smooth. "Mr. Bennett, thank you for your concern. The HOA has determined that the beach access path adjacent to your property falls under common area management. All changes are in accordance with the newly adopted Community Preservation Plan. We appreciate your cooperation. Sincerely, HOA Board." I read it 3 times, heart-thumping. That path was my connection, not just to the beach, but to my past, my wife, my healing. And now it was being reduced to a common area management zone. Over the next few days, construction began. Metal posts went in. A tall black fence with a locked gate followed. A keypad was installed. Access, they said, would be granted to residents in good standing. When I asked what that meant, I was told my dues were up to date, but that I needed to submit a coastal compliance form to be issued a beach code. The form? It required a photo of my house, HOA approval, of my landscaping, and a signature affirming I understood I had no legal claim to the path. I refused to sign. Within a week, my access code was denied. The gate buzzed, flashed red, and clicked locked every time I approached. I stood on my own land, looking through a metal fence at the sea I used to reach in bare feet. That same sea that had held my wife's ashes. That same path where I had taught my niece to spot pelican tracks in the sand. Something cracked in me then. I wasn't just angry, I was grieving all over again. This wasn't about rules, this was about erasure, quiet, bureaucratic, and cruel. And I wasn't going to let it stand. The fence gleamed under the morning sun, a line of polished black arrogance, slicing through the landscape like a scar. I stood there for a long time, hands still on the cold keypad that had just rejected me again. Behind me, the wind whipped through the palms, carrying the distant sound of children laughing from a nearby house. But in front of me, silence. No waves. No gulls. Just the barrier. I walked back to my porch, slower than usual, like every step was carrying weight it didn't know how to set down. I sat on the bench my wife and I had built, the one with the uneven slats and the sun-bleached armrests, and stared at the clipboard I'd brought out from my file cabinet. It wasn't the first time I'd had to deal with red tape. During my time in the Navy, I'd managed logistics and base compliance in more than a dozen ports. I'd wrangled city councils, foreign contractors, and federal auditors. And if there was one thing I'd learned, it was this: power loves silence. It thrives on assumption, and the moment you question it, openly, loudly, it stumbles. So I started digging. First, I went to the county assessor's website. I pulled the plat maps for our subdivision and cross-referenced them with the original land grant documents I had tucked away in a dusty folder. My property had a 10-foot wide public beach easement running from the rear fence to the dunes, clearly marked and dated, filed with the city over 40 years ago. But somewhere between that filing and the HOA's fence installation, the language had changed. In the HOA's newly printed community plan, that same easement was labeled Common Access, subject to HOA governance. No explanation, no footnotes. I printed it out, highlighted the discrepancies, and took it with me to the HOA's monthly meeting. They held it at the community clubhouse, an overly perfumed building with faux marble floors and an aggressive air conditioner that hummed like it was hiding something. I showed up 10 minutes early, clutching my documents, wearing the same pressed shirt I used to wear to debriefings. Evelyn Whitaker sat at the head of the long folding table, surrounded by 3 other board members, all of them sipping bottled water like they were prepping for a debate. Her smile tightened when she saw me. "Mr. Bennett," she said with a practiced calm, "you're not on the agenda tonight." "No," I said. "But the beach easement is." She glanced at her assistant, then gave a little shrug. "You may speak during resident remarks. 3 minutes." I didn't need more than 2. I laid out the original plat maps, the documents showing the easement designation. I explained the legal difference between an HOA-managed common area and a city-granted public right-of-way. I spoke clearly without raising my voice, but with the kind of presence that only years in command can teach you. When I finished, Evelyn leaned forward and tapped her pen against the table. "Thank you, Mr. Bennett. As I mentioned in my email, the HOA's legal team has reviewed the matter and determined we are in compliance. But we appreciate your passion for community issues." She moved on to the next speaker before I could say another word. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat on the back porch until 2 a.m., watching the moonlight fall on the fence line like a mockery. The ocean was still out there, but it felt farther than ever. The next morning, I called the city's zoning department. It took 3 transfers and 1 very confused intern. But I finally reached someone who understood what I was talking about, a man named Greg with a raspy voice and a dry sense of humor. "Yeah, I've heard about that HOA," he said. "They've been trying to annex beach access for months. It's been a mess." "Can I get a copy of the easement file on record?" I asked. "You already have it," he replied. "But what you don't have is the amendment they submitted last year. It got flagged for review but never approved." "What do you mean?" He chuckled bitterly. "I mean, their paperwork was rejected. The city never gave them authority to restrict access. As far as we're concerned, that fence is in violation." My breath caught. They built a locked gate across a public easement without permission. "That's exactly what I'm saying." I thanked him, got the rejection letter faxed to my home office, and stared at it for a long time. It was real. It was undeniable. And it meant the HOA had overstepped blatantly, arrogantly, and illegally. But what should have been a moment of relief was quickly tempered by something else, a flicker of fury. They knew. They had to know. No board installs a gate and changes access codes without at least pretending to check city permissions, which meant they weren't just mistaken, they were counting on silence, on compliance, on no one like me standing up and saying, "You don't get to take this." I took a walk down the fence line again this time, with a measuring tape and my phone. I took photos, documented the posts, recorded a video describing what had happened. I narrated it calmly like I was filing a report. I even marked the exact point where the fence crossed the boundary line, 6 inches inside the public easement. Then I sat on my porch and started writing letters, one to the HOA demanding removal, one to the city reporting the unauthorized structure, and one to the local paper offering a personal op-ed on the importance of public coastal access. But even as I drafted legal action, something inside me ached. This wasn't just about land. It was about loss. About how a gate can turn a life into a cage. about how a committee can become a regime if no one dares push back, about how the death of one small path could represent the death of memory, of meaning, of freedom. And I wasn't about to bury that path without a fight. By the time I submitted the formal complaint to the city, the fence had become a symbol in the neighborhood of control, of quiet fear, and of something most folks didn't want to talk about. At the next HOA meeting, the topic of the beach gate wasn't even on the agenda. It was as if they thought if they ignored me long enough, I'd just go away. But I wasn't built that way. When you've been in a war zone, when you've stared down storms at sea, and when you've buried the love of your life, a fence isn't just metal and bolts, it's a dare. I didn't just wait for the city to act. I started talking to my neighbors, especially the ones with kids. People who'd quietly used that beach access for years without thinking twice. They were hesitant at first, cautious, unsure if pushing back would somehow get them fined or blacklisted. The HOA had a reputation for being punitive. People who missed dues by a week found nasty letters taped to their doors. One family down the street was fined for hanging a wind chime that apparently violated the auditory aesthetics clause. HOA control was invisible, but it was everywhere. Still, I found allies, folks like Maria, a widowed teacher who used to walk her dog along the beach every morning, and Tom, a retired EMT who'd seen too many HOA power trips over the years to keep quiet anymore. We started gathering on my porch, first 3 of us, then 5, then 9. They shared stories of intimidation, of confusing fines, of fear that if they said something they'd lose their community standing, or worse, access to their own amenities. I showed them the documents from the city, the original easement, the rejection letter, proof that the HOA had no right to block the path. "Why don't we sue Maria?" asked one night. "We will," I said. "But not yet. We need public pressure first. Let's shine a light." So we launched something small, but powerful. A website, freeourbeach.org. Tom's grandson helped us set it up. I wrote a blog post from the heart titled "The Gate That Stole My Grief." It was raw, personal, and laid out everything: the loss of my wife, the history of the path, the illegal actions of the HOA. I didn't name names, I didn't insult anyone, I just told the truth. And it spread. Within a week, the local paper picked it up. A local radio host read part of my blog on air. And then one afternoon, a van with a local news station logo rolled down our quiet street and stopped in front of my house. The reporter, a sharp-eyed young woman named Lila Tran, interviewed me right on the porch. I spoke slowly, deliberately, letting the camera capture the tremble in my voice when I spoke about the day I scattered my wife's ashes at the end of that very path. I let them film the locked gate, the keypad, the metal sign that said, "HOA members only. Trespassers will be prosecuted." I didn't need to act angry. I didn't need to yell. The story spoke for itself. When the segment aired that night, everything changed. I woke the next morning to dozens of emails. Former residents wrote to say they remembered using that path as kids. Local lawyers reached out offering help pro bono. A coastal preservation nonprofit sent me a message saying they were deeply concerned about the HOA's actions and had already filed an inquiry with the city council. But with the attention came escalation. That same morning, I received a formal notice from the HOA. I was being fined $1,000 for unauthorized gatherings that promote division within the community, a thinly veiled threat. Then came the certified mail envelope, warning that spreading misinformation could result in legal action under the HOA's anti-defamation clause. I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because I'd seen this before in war zones, in boardrooms, in small-town bureaucracies. Bullies always punch hardest when they feel power slipping away. So I punched back with facts. I requested a public hearing, not just with the HOA, but with the city. I sent copies of the fence photos, the property records, and every threatening letter to the zoning board. I attached the video news report and demanded an investigation into the HOA's unauthorized construction on public land. Meanwhile, the neighborhood murmurs grew louder. People began attending HOA meetings in larger numbers. They started asking questions. Why weren't the board's financials transparent? Why did so many decisions seem to happen behind closed doors? Why had the HOA ignored city law? One night I returned home to find a brown envelope tucked under my doormat. No return address. Inside were copies of internal HOA emails. One from Evelyn, dated weeks before the fence went up, read, "We need to move fast before anyone notices. The city isn't enforcing as strictly as usual. If we make it look official, people will fall in line. I felt my chest tighten as I read it again. It wasn't just arrogance. It was premeditated deceit. I made copies, dozens. The next day, I stapled one to the gate. People stopped. They read. They took photos. And slowly that quiet rage began to burn. That weekend, something unexpected happened. A group of kids' teens from the next street over started leaving messages on the gate in sidewalk chalk. Let us see the sea. Our beach, too. She walked here every day. Let her rest. The HOA scrubbed them off. The kids came back the next day with more chalk. And someone I still don't know, who hung a simple, hand-painted sign over the keypad. The sea doesn't belong to a board. It was beautiful, and it broke me a little, because it meant the fight wasn't just mine anymore. It was ours. The city hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning, 10 a.m. sharp, a time most working folks couldn't attend. That was by design, I suspected. Bureaucracies know when people are least likely to show up. But I wasn't most people. I arrived early, clutching my file folder like it was a shield, dressed in a crisp, button-down shirt and clean boots, ready for whatever came next. To my surprise, others showed up too. Maria brought a thermos of coffee and 2 folding chairs. Tom wore his old EMT jacket and carried a sign that said, "Don't fence the future." And behind them, at least 20 neighbors filtered into the narrow conference room at City Hall, including a group of high schoolers from the local civics class. Apparently, their teacher had assigned them to observe the proceedings. The atmosphere was strange, half courtroom, half town meeting. Council members sat behind a curved desk, papers, neatly arranged microphones blinking red. At the center of it all was a man named Mr. Larson, the city's zoning compliance director, flanked by his assistant, and a thin stack of printed documents. Evelyn arrived just before the hearing began, wearing a navy blue suit and pearls that looked tight enough to strangle her. She smiled like nothing was wrong and took a seat next to a man in a gray suit, an attorney, judging by the way he never blinked and never smiled. Mr. Larson began by summarizing the complaint an HOA had erected a locked fence on land previously designated as a public easement. He stated the city had received conflicting documents and was now here to hear both sides. I was called up first. I stood my knees steady and opened with the story of the path not as an abstract legal argument, but as a living thread woven into the fabric of the neighborhood. I spoke of the old plat maps, the easement recorded in the county archives, the city's own rejection of the HOA's proposed boundary changes. I referenced the signed letter from Greg at the zoning office, and finally, the leaked internal email from Evelyn. I watched the council members shift in their chairs as I spoke. They weren't immune to emotion. They were people, after all, and people understand when something sacred is being stolen. When I finished, Mr. Larson nodded, then turned to the HOA. The attorney spoke first. While we regret the perception of overreach, he said the HOA acted with the intent of preserving community safety and ensuring responsible access to shared resources. As the board interpreted the documents in question, they reasonably believed they were within their rights. Then came Evelyn. "I sympathize with Mr. Bennett," she began, eyes fluttering just long enough to suggest rehearsed sincerity. "But as president of the HOA, my responsibility is to the greater good. And when residents from neighboring areas began using the path irresponsibly, leaving trash, hosting bonfires, bringing dogs off leash, we had to act." The gate was a necessary measure. Gasps from the room. Mr. Larson raised a hand. "Is there any documented complaint or citation supporting this claim?" She faltered. "Not formally, but any correspondence with city enforcement regarding these incidents?" "No, but did you obtain approval from the city before construction of the gate?" A long pause. Then we believed we didn't need to. That was it. The pivot point. The moment the mask slipped. The council voted unanimously. The HOA was ordered to remove the fence within 14 days or face daily fines and potential civil litigation. Furthermore, the city would conduct an audit of all HOA modifications made in the past 18 months for possible zoning violations. Evelyn's face drained of color. Her attorney whispered something sharp into her ear. I didn't catch the words, but I caught the tone. After the hearing, people clapped not loudly, but with that kind of quiet respect that hits deeper than cheers. Maria squeezed my hand. Tom grinned and said, "That's how you fight a war without firing a shot." But the war wasn't over. The next morning, I received another letter. This one slipped into my mailbox without postage. Resign your complaint, or we'll find something to ruin you. No signature, just a typed line at the bottom. This is your last warning. I took the letter to the police. An officer read it, frowned, and said, "It's vague, but it's harassment. We'll open a report." He asked if I wanted a patrol car to pass by my house for a few nights. Sure, I said, but I've faced worse than threats on paper. Still, it made me uneasy. That night, I walked the perimeter of my property, with a flashlight checking locks, securing my shed, making sure the power box hadn't been tampered with. I wasn't scared. I was watchful. But what unsettled me most wasn't the letter. It was the idea that someone, possibly a neighbor, had delivered it. That's the poison of the bad HOA. It doesn't just regulate fences and paint colors. It plants seeds of distrust. It turns neighbors into enemies, into spies, into cowards, hiding behind anonymous threats. 2 days later, the fence was gone. I watched from my porch as a truck with the HOA's logo pulled up and 2 workers dismantled the black bars, loaded them into the flatbed, and drove away without a word. The gatepost, the keypad, the sign all vanished by sunset. The path to the beach lay open again. That evening, I walked it slowly. Sand shifted under my boots, sea oats swayed in the breeze, and the air smelled like salt and victory. When I reached the dunes, I sat in the same spot my wife used to love. I brought a folding chair and an old photo of her, propped it in my lap, and stayed until the stars came out. I didn't cry, not exactly, but I felt something release, like the tide taking back what was always its own. I still had work to do. The HOA was weakened, but not gone. There were new board elections coming, and I intended to make sure they were fair, transparent, honest. But for now, I had the beach, and sometimes that's enough. The days that followed the fence's removal were some of the quietest I'd experienced in years. Not for lack of activity, but for the kind of calm that settles when something unjust has finally been undone. The path to the beach was open again, as it always should have been, and my neighbors began to return to it like pilgrims rediscovering a sacred trail. But underneath the surface of peace, something deeper stirred. I could see it in the way people spoke to each other now, with longer eye contact, with softer tones, as if we all carried a bruise that hadn't fully healed. We'd been neighbors before. Now we were co-survivors of a shared violation. And like all recoveries, ours required truth time and reckoning. It wasn't long before HOA board elections were announced. Normally, they were unceremonious affairs, 3 people running unopposed, barely enough ballots returned to hit quorum. This time, though, things were different. 3 new candidates had emerged, Maria Tom and a quiet woman named Rachel Chen, a retired attorney who had lived in the neighborhood for over a decade, but had never attended a meeting until the beach dispute broke the silence. Their campaign wasn't flashy. They didn't promise barbecues or splash pads or discounted tennis courts. They promised clarity, transparency, a community guided by service instead of control. They used my porch as their meeting spot. The same weathered boards where I had once sat alone in grief now held the weight of clipboards, flyers, posters, and hope. Rachel brought charts, Tom brought beer, Maria brought muffins and fire. Meanwhile, the old guard clung to what power they had left. Evelyn, though silent in public since the fence debacle, quietly circulated glossy brochures claiming anti-HOA radicals were trying to undermine neighborhood values. Her closest allies, those who had nodded along while she seized more and more control, doubled down on their rhetoric. One of them, a man named Carl Ramsey, even accused me of colluding with media outlets to damage the community's image. He said this during a candidate Q&A session in the community clubhouse, his voice shaking with what I could only describe as theatrical rage. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The audience's silence in that moment said more than I ever could. But if I thought the election would come down to speeches and flyers, I underestimated the depths of desperation. 2 weeks before voting day, Tom's mailbox was smashed in with a brick. Maria found her tires slashed one morning, and Rachel received an anonymous email stating, "If you win, you'll regret stepping out of your lane." The police were notified. Reports were filed. But suspicion grew like mold, quiet, persistent, impossible to scrub out. Neighbors began installing cameras, checking over their shoulders, whispering to each other about what else the HOA might be capable of. One afternoon, I found my own garden gnome, something my wife had bought me as a joke years ago, snapped in half. A small thing meaningless to most, but to me it felt personal, targeted, as if someone wanted to remind me they were still watching. And yet we didn't back down. We hosted a town hall in the park. Rachel read aloud the HOA's bylaws, yes aloud line by line until the sun set. Tom brought a whiteboard and drew diagrams of how HOA funds had been allocated down to the dollar. Maria handed out buttons that simply read, "Beach belongs to everyone." People showed up, in lawn chairs, on scooters, holding hands with their kids. It wasn't just about the beach anymore. It was about something deeper, the right to breathe freely in the place you call home. On election day, something happened that hadn't occurred in years. We had a turnout of over 70% of residents. Ballots were submitted by hand, by mail, by every method allowed. And when the results were read aloud on a cool Friday night under the gazebo, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Maria, Rachel, Tom, they won by a landslide. Evelyn didn't even show up. A new chapter began that night, not with fireworks or fanfare, but with 3 neighbors standing at the front of a folding table promising to do better. And for the first time in a long while, I believed them. But even then, healing wasn't linear. There were still scowls in grocery aisles, still cold shoulders at morning dog walks. Not everyone was ready to forgive. Not everyone wanted to. And that was okay. Democracy isn't about agreement. It's about the right to disagree without fear. One evening, about a month later, I sat on the beach with Rachel. We hadn't planned it. We'd both just happened to walk there around the same time, and she asked if she could sit beside me. She pulled out a small thermos of tea and poured me a cup. The stars were coming out. "You ever wonder," she said, "how many people it really takes to change something?" I nodded, sometimes just one, but it helps when a few more join in. She smiled. "You were the first. Don't forget that." I looked at the sea, at the moon shimmering on the water, and felt my throat tighten. I hadn't realized how much I needed to hear that. Because in the end, it wasn't about revenge. It was about restoration. The path to the beach was never just sand and space. It was a right, a memory, a thread between past and present. And that sign, the one I'd placed with my own hands after the fence came down, it still stood at the entrance. Public beach access protected by law. People touched it when they walked by. Some took pictures. A few left flowers at the base, not for the sign, but for what it meant. And every now and then, when I sit quietly enough, I swear I can still hear her laugh in the waves. Summer came early that year. The mornings were warmer, the tides gentler, and for the first time in what felt like ages, the neighborhood moved with a kind of slow, cautious optimism. I'd taken to walking the beach path, every sunrise coffee in hand, letting the silence speak first. Sometimes Maria or Tom would join me. Sometimes I walked alone. But always I paused at the sign. Public beach access protected by law. The wood had weathered, softened by salt and sun, but the letters were still bold, still defiant, still true. One morning, I found a small stone placed carefully at the foot of the post. Painted in neat, looping handwriting were the words, "Thank you." I didn't know who had left it. I never found out. But I added my own stone, beside it, blank, smooth, cool from the night air, and left it there without a word. As summer deepened, the new HOA board got to work. They opened up meetings to anyone who wanted to attend, no more locked doors or pre-screened questions. They published financials online, removed outdated fines, and launched a community survey asking what people actually wanted. Turns out, it wasn't fancy. People wanted freedom, a place to walk, a neighborhood that didn't treat them like criminals for painting their doors the wrong shade of blue, a beach they could visit without asking permission. Small victories piled up. The garden rules were relaxed. The HOA newsletter replaced stern warnings with handwritten notes from neighbors. Evelyn's old regime faded into a bitter memory. Though she still lived in the neighborhood, her blinds forever drawn. I thought I'd feel triumphant. Instead, I felt hollow. It took me weeks to figure out why. Until one night, just past sunset, I found myself standing again by the path, staring at the sea, and I realized my fight had filled the hole she'd left behind. The war with the HOA had given me purpose, momentum. Something to fix, something to protect. Now that it was over, I was alone with my thoughts again. That was the scariest part. Grief doesn't always come with tears. Sometimes it sits beside you like an old friend. Quiet, familiar, uninvited, but not entirely unwelcome. I didn't try to push it away. I just let it breathe. Then I started building. Not fences, not walls, a bench, right at the edge of the path where the sand began to shift beneath your feet. I used driftwood where I could, sealed it against the salt, and carved her name beneath the seat, Clara. Simple, small, private. But people noticed. Soon there were fresh flowers tucked into the corners. Then someone added a little plaque in honor of the one who walked with love. I didn't know who wrote it. I didn't ask. One day, Rachel came by. She sat with me on the bench and didn't say a word for nearly 20 minutes. Then she reached into her bag and handed me a piece of folded paper. It was a printed email, an archived thread from 2 years ago between the old HOA board and a private development firm. The subject line read, "Proposal Gated Beachfront Renovation." I read the first few lines and felt the anger rise like a slow tide. We can push the access point back by claiming safety concerns. If we install a digital gate and assign codes only to board-approved members, the foot traffic will reduce, and it'll be easier to pitch Phase 2 beach enhancements to private investors. Phase 2. Private investors. They hadn't just wanted control, they'd wanted to sell it. So that's what it was all along, I said, my voice rough. They were never protecting the beach. They were positioning it. Rachel nodded. We got lucky. They overreached too fast. I leaned back against the bench. How many other neighborhoods don't get lucky? She didn't answer. She didn't need to. That night, I wrote a new blog post. Not just about our fight, but about the broader pattern, how unchecked HOAs across the country quietly chip away at public spaces, all under the guise of community management. I included links, resources, stories from other homeowners who had written to me in the months since the gate came down. The post went viral. Within a week, I was interviewed by a national outlet, then another. A podcast invited me to speak. Someone reached out to ask if I'd testify in support of new legislation about public easements. And somewhere in all of that, I realized something. This wasn't the end. It was just the start of something bigger. The beach had taught me many things: grief, patience, defiance. Now it was teaching me legacy. Not just for Clara, not just for me, but for every homeowner who felt silenced by a committee, every neighbor who'd been bullied into submission by red tape and power suits. I didn't want to be a martyr. I didn't want revenge anymore. I wanted protection, reform, justice with roots. So I joined a coalition, started speaking up, not loudly, not angrily, just clearly, calmly. Like I did the day I walked into City Hall and told the truth. Back home, the sign still stood. The bench still faced the water. And the path still welcomed bare feet and bike tires and the occasional happy dog sprinting toward the waves. I still walk it every morning. And sometimes, just sometimes, I swear I feel her walking beside me. The rhythm of life began to return slow, but steady, like the tide itself. My days followed a simple pattern: mornings on the beach path, afternoons spent volunteering with the new HOA board, and evenings writing. Not just blog posts anymore. I started documenting stories, not just mine, but others. It began when a man from Colorado sent me a letter. His HOA had fined him $2,500 for installing a wheelchair ramp without architectural approval, even though his wife had just returned home from spinal surgery. His words were raw, his frustration palpable. He said he felt like a prisoner in his own home, that the neighborhood he once loved had become a bureaucratic trap. I wrote him back. Then a woman from Florida reached out. Her HOA had removed a memorial tree from her front yard, a tree planted in honor of her son, a fallen soldier. They claimed it didn't conform to landscape regulations. Then came stories from Arizona, Georgia, New Jersey. Each one a variation on a theme power used not to build, but to bend people until they broke. And I began to see the truth more clearly than ever. What had happened in our little beachside neighborhood wasn't an anomaly. It was a microcosm. So I kept writing. I created a series on my website called Stories from the Fence. Each week, I posted a new account from someone else: a teacher fined for tutoring in her home, a grandfather ticketed for flying an American flag 1 inch too high, a mother sued for building a little free library for the kids on her block. I told their stories the way I'd told mine, calmly, honestly, and with the kind of emotion that comes not from outrage, but from experience. The site exploded. Within months, I had over 100,000 subscribers. National newspapers began referencing the stories in editorials. Homeowner rights groups cited the blog in legal cases. A senator from Oregon referenced one of my posts during a committee hearing. But I didn't feel like an activist. I felt like a conduit. The HOA in my neighborhood tried to pretend it wasn't happening. Some of the old guard resigned quietly. Evelyn sold her house under a whisper of an HOA audit and moved 2 counties away. No farewell party, no Facebook announcement, just a moving truck and a void. I thought I'd feel satisfied. Instead, I felt released. Some ghosts don't leave, they just grow quieter. With Rachel as president, the new HOA board became what it should have always been: supportive, responsive, humble. They removed the labyrinthine fine system. They created a forgiveness program for people who'd been over-penalized. They established open office hours at the clubhouse. Tom ran those sitting behind a desk with a bowl of free candy and a whiteboard that said, "Let's talk." And people did. Something about that simple act being heard began to mend us. It wasn't perfect. One woman still insisted that Christmas decorations should come down by January 2nd or face penalty, but she was gently voted down. A man tried to get approval for a 6-foot-tall Bigfoot statue in his yard. That one got approved after much debate and a community vote that ended in laughter. We were becoming human again. As for me, I stayed involved, though I resisted the push from many to run for the board. That wasn't my role anymore. I was the guy on the porch, the man with the path, the one who still walked it every morning and nodded to each neighbor like it was a quiet form of blessing. The bench I'd built for Clara became a gathering place. Couples sat there at sunset. Kids leaned their bikes against it. I'd sometimes find seashells laid gently across the seat like offerings. I never removed them. One morning, a boy named Liam, about 7 years old, came walking down the path holding his grandfather's hand. I was sitting on the bench when they stopped. Liam looked at the sign. "Grandpa, who put that there?" The old man pointed at me. He did. Liam turned. "Why?" I smiled. "Because people were forgetting who the beach belonged to." He looked at me for a long moment, then nodded like he understood more than he should have. After they left, I sat for a while with my coffee and the sound of the waves. The breeze was soft that day, and the sky so clear you could see straight into the horizon. And I thought about something I hadn't dared say aloud. That I was happy, not in the jubilant fireworks kind of way, but in the way that feels like breath, like stillness, like returning home after a long, difficult journey and finding the light still on. The beach was mine again, ours again. And though I had lost much, I had found something too, something resilient and invisible and deep. Community, not the kind written into bylaws or measured by dues, the real kind. Built through fire, fortified by truth, and made strong not by walls but by stories. And I would keep telling them, because somewhere out there, another fence was going up. And someone needed to know they weren't alone. I never set out to be a voice for anyone. I just wanted my beach back. I wanted a sliver of dignity after everything else life had stripped away. But once the stories started coming, emails, letters, phone calls, I realized I'd stepped into something much larger than myself. The press called me the beach man once. I hated it. Because the truth was, I wasn't fighting a fence. I was fighting what the fence represented: the quiet normalization of being ruled in your own home. Rules without recourse. Power without humility. Authority without empathy. I began getting invited to community forums. I was nervous at first. Public speaking had never been my gift, but something changed when I stood behind a podium and looked into the eyes of people who had felt exactly what I had felt. Betrayal, helplessness, a simmering anger, tolerant hope. I'd begin every talk the same way. I lost my wife. Then I almost lost the only place that kept her close. But I stood up because I had nothing left to lose. You don't have to wait until it's that dark. You can stand now. The room would always fall silent. Not a silence of boredom, but one of recognition. Clara. I traveled to 6 different states over the next year. Arizona, Florida, Texas, Georgia, Oregon, Maryland. Each community had its own flavor, its own culture. But the stories were eerily similar. Gated communities where HOAs fined veterans for flying flags. Condos where elderly women were sued for putting up small shrines for their late husbands. Entire cul-de-sacs where no one dared speak out because the board president had been there since the Reagan administration and knew people. Some communities had rallied and changed. Others were still afraid. Some had given up entirely. I always carried a photo of my sign, the simple wooden one. Public beach access protected by law. It became a symbol in its own right. Some towns began crafting their own versions. In Michigan, a woman sent me a picture of a sign she'd made after her HOA tried to restrict access to a community garden. It read, "This land feeds us, protected by purpose." In California, a neighborhood fighting a tree removal mandate erected a sign that read, "Shade is not a vice." It was like a quiet rebellion had begun, one not of rage, but of reclaiming. Not with lawsuits first, but with community first. The HOAs in my neighborhood tried to pretend it wasn't happening. Some of the old guard resigned quietly. Evelyn's old HOA board sold her house under a whisper of an audit and moved 2 counties away. No farewell party, no Facebook announcement, just a moving truck and a void. I thought I'd feel satisfied. Instead, I didn't. I didn't feel satisfied. I felt free. With Rachel as president, the new HOA board became what it should have always been: supportive, responsive, humble. She was a woman. They removed the labyrinthine fine system fines. They created a program to forgive for people who'd been over-penalized. They established open office hours at the clubhouse, open to anyone. Tom ran those sitting behind a desk with a bowl of free candy and a whiteboard that said, "Let's talk." And they talked. Something about that simple act being heard was enough. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. One woman still insisted on it that Christmas decorations should come down after December by January 2nd, but she was outvoted, gently voted down. Another guy, a man, tried to wanted approval for a 6-foot Bigfoot statue in his front yard. It passed. That got approved after much debate and a community vote that ended in laughter. We were human again. And me, I stayed involved, but said no to running resisted for the board. That wasn't my place role anymore. I was just a guy on the porch, just a man with a path, just someone who walked it daily every morning and nodded. The bench for Clara, my Clara was a place where couples sat at dusk, where kids parked their bikes, where I'd sometimes find shells offerings I left them alone, never touched. One morning, a boy, Lila Liam, 7 years old, walked down the path with his grandpa holding hands tight. I was on my bench when they paused, stopped. Lila Liam looked, pointing at the sign. Grandpa, who put it there, he pointed to me. I did. I nodded. He's right. Why? I smiled. Because people forgot who the beach belonged to. He stared, then nodded as if he got it understood more than he should. When they were gone, I sat with my coffee listening to waves. The breeze was soft today, the sky open so clear you could see forever the horizon. And I thought I was happy, not with fireworks, but with breath, with stillness, with home after a long, hard journey home. The beach was mine again, ours again. And though much was lost, I'd found something resilient, invisible, deep. Community, not in bylaws or dues, the real kind, real. Built through fire, forged by truth, made strong not by walls but by stories. And I'd keep telling them, because somewhere another fence was rising, going up. And someone needed to know they weren't alone.